predictably, our topic for this week continues to be Afghanistan, where we started off last week. Before we kind of dive in, one of the big topics on everybody's mind has been the service members that were killed last week.
One of the probably the worst thing about being in a theater of war is the possibility of losing Americans and soldiers. And we lost 13 of them this past week in Kabul due to a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device that was executed by a terrorist group. And, you know, in my service in DOD and in other departments, that is the single most hard, difficult thing to endure when you have to go home and inform their families that their loved ones aren't coming home. And I just wanted to acknowledge the families before we started the show of those that had fallen in the last week. You know, their loss is not in vain as far as I'm concerned. They were serving a mission to help others who could not endure that mission themselves. And so it's a very real way that impacts you when you're serving alongside them or in the DoD community, that makes the decisions you make real. Because, you know, like when I was running the Department of Defense, there's always a lot potential for loss of life in any of these conflicts. And we had the biggest fatality, unfortunately, since Extortion 17 in 2011. So it's quite a significant date, and we just wanted to acknowledge it and let the families know that we're with them.
I understand that they've now been airlifted to the U.S.
Yeah. So what happens when service members are killed in combat or in a theater of war is there's a process called a dignified transfer, and they are airlifted on military transport planes with their coffins and the flags draped over them, and there's a formal transfer of their remains to the family members who are also at Dover, usually with high-level government officials. And I had to do one when I was chief of staff at Dover just last year. We lost 5 soldiers at a helicopter crash in Egypt. And you go there, and the most important thing is you meet with the families. It's also the most difficult thing I've ever done in my entire career. You can't help but weep with them. You can't help but realize the magnitude of their loss, and that your decisions could cause you to return to Dover for another dignified transfer. And of course, we do everything we can to avoid that, but that makes your calculations, especially in a theater of war, so much more precise and necessary and needed to be based on intelligence and sound advice. And so we try to learn from them, but those are some really hard times. The hardest.
As we're filming, basically the 31st deadline is looming. So it's going to be past the 31st when this episode airs. There's a lot of eyes on America and what America's doing, eyes on Afghanistan. And there's a lot of questions about, what really should happen next, even like what is the mission at this point? I think.
Yeah, it's a great question that you should ask of any administration that's leading the effort. And right now it's President Biden's administration. And unfortunately, I don't know that there is a plan except this so-called withdrawal date of 31 August. And what I've been telling people lately is this is not a withdrawal. This is an evacuation. This is an unconditional surrender of a position in a theater of war we've been in for 20 years. And we are reacting to situations as they occur. We are reacting to try and airlift American citizens in country out. We're trying to get Afghan allies that worked with us for decades out of the country who are being targeted by terrorists. And the suicide bombs or the vehicle-borne improvised explosive device from last week make that threat real. And what I would like to have seen or see now is an actual plan. My biggest fear is that come 31 August, we are going to leave thousands of Americans stranded in Afghanistan and without a plan to get them home. And that's going to subject them to becoming hostages of terrorist organizations that are still in country. And that makes the plan or lack thereof in Afghanistan all the more complicated and all the more deadly.
So And from what I understand, the Taliban are basically asking for the money that was being transferred to the Afghan government now that I guess the Taliban is at least saying that they're forming the official government.
Well, so it just rewinded a little bit. Yeah, so the Afghan government was always funded in part by America because the Afghan government didn't have a revenue stream that they could secure to run their entire center of operations. And now what the Taliban is saying is, we, the Taliban, are the government. We are the Afghan government. We are the President Ghani government. So please give us the money to run Afghanistan. And I don't know what the decision point is going to be for this administration, but it's a critical one. Are we going to give the Taliban money when we know, and we can get into it in more details, what some of their actions have led to recently? The 13 soldiers being killed, namely up front, is the one that comes to mind. But there's also the failure of the Taliban to permit American citizens to leave Afghanistan that wanted to leave. And it's not just their failure, it's also a failure of this government right now in terms of not going out into the country and retrieving Americans like we should have planned to do ahead of time. That's why it's not a withdrawal plan, it's an evacuation, and which was highlighted most significantly by our Chinook helicopters literally airlifting Americans off the rooftops of our embassy in Kabul, something we haven't seen since Saigon in '75.
At this exact point in time where we're at, what could be the next steps?
You know, I'm out of government, so I don't know if they'll listen to me, or unlikely. But here's what I know what me and my team would have done. We would never, and I've outlined previously sort of the conditions-based withdrawal that President Trump was going to, or did implement and did execute when I was running the Department of Defense. But basically, we were never going to leave Bagram, first and foremost. It's our center of operations. You cannot operate in Afghanistan without Bagram. And what I've been hearing and reading about lately is that the military leaders under this administration, that being the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and others, gave the advice to this president that they did not need Bagram. I don't know if that's accurate, but that's what's being purported in media, and I could not disagree more. I don't know what intelligence they're looking at, because that intelligence hasn't existed in the 20 years we've been in country, and I don't think it changed overnight or over the course of a week. So either that's the position, that's what they were advising him, or they advised they advised President Biden differently, and he chose to leave Bagram anyway. Ultimately, the decision is the commander-in-chief, so the decision was with President Biden, and the surrender of Bagram having cascading effects on not just our machinery and our weaponry, but our ability to go and save Americans who are stranded in Afghanistan.
So tell me a little more about sort of the importance of this base. Like, why is this such a kind of centerpiece?
So Kabul, you know, and having been there a couple of times, Kabul is basically a civilian runway that is in a valley, meaning it's surrounded by hills. And so from an operational security perspective, that's not good because you can basically aim down, have height coverage, and you are at a vulnerable position on the ground. Bagram, which is about 23 miles away from Kabul, was a separate geographic landscape that we, the United States military, owned and were able to securely house our soldiers and NATO soldiers as well. Our allied partners were there as well, not to mention be the central hub of military transport, helicopters, airplanes, and different kinds of air assets, and house machinery, billions of dollars of machinery, not just weapons and bombs and guns and ammunition, but our cyber capabilities, our technological capabilities. To run a theater of war, you need a logistical, what we call logistical node. And think about it this way. If you wanted to run any sort of operation outside of war, you'd need to be able to service the men and women who were there. You need everything from laundry to food service to mail service to communications equipment to recreation, morale and welfare boosting services. You need to provide this mini town all the logistical support they needed to function and to operate. And that's what Bagram was for us, for all of Afghanistan. Basically, it was the linchpin. And losing that caused us, I think, a cataclysmic implosion of our security posture in the country. And we saw the results of it in days with unfortunate bombings by terrorists against our military.
So in this reality, without the linchpin as you're describing it, without Bagram, what could be done here at this point?
Well, there's a couple of things. We could restage to retake Bagram, and that would require some bit of military lift. And I get that the people in the media and the politicians will say, oh, we're going back into Afghanistan. Well, we up and left without a plan. So now it's the time to implement an actual plan, a strategy that will allow us to safely remove American citizens, our weaponry, our machinery, and get out of Afghanistan in a coherent fashion. If we don't want to go in and retake Bagram, there are other bases around the country that we could shift operations to, should the commander-in-chief decide to do that, to take the logistical component and shift it over there, to take our security requirements and move them over there, and to take our allies and house them there along with our soldiers, and have it be a point for lift, as we call it, lift operations for helicopters and airplanes, to conduct the necessary security movement.